Imagine standing before the oracle of Delphi, the air thick with incense, your heart pounding as you wait to hear the words that could change the course of your life or your kingdom. Now picture this. The prophecy you receive isn't just a glimpse into the future, but a carefully crafted script written by powerful hands behind the scenes. This wasn't just fantasy, it was the reality of ancient courts, where kings and emperors didn't just wield swords and armies, but something far more potent, the power to shape destiny itself. For centuries, rulers from Babylon to Rome understood that controlling prophecy wasn't about mysticism, it was about control. They knew that if you could make people believe their fate was written in the stars, you could make them bow without raising a blade. Think about the last time you heard someone say, "It was meant to be." Now imagine an entire empire running on that idea, where every coronation, every war, every downfall was spun as the inevitable will of the gods. Ancient rulers were master storytellers, turning vague omens into divine mandates, rewriting history to fit their narratives, and even planting fake prophecies to silence their enemies. The Oracle of Delphi, the Sibylline books of Rome, the celestial charts of Chinese emperors, these weren't just spiritual tools. They were weapons of psychological warfare, designed to make obedience feel like destiny. And the terrifying truth, it worked. People lived and died by these manipulated visions, never suspecting that the gods' voices might actually be the whispers of politicians. But here's the twist, these ancient tactics aren't as distant as you might think. The art of shaping fate didn't vanish with togas and sandals, it evolved. Today, leaders and media still use the same playbook, wrapping their agendas in the language of inevitability. So how did ancient courts pull off this grand illusion? And how can we spot when history or headlines are being rewritten before our eyes? In this video, we're peeling back the curtain on the greatest propaganda machine of the ancient world, the manipulation of prophecy and fate. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a prediction or a politician the same way again. The question is, are you ready to see how the game was really played? Prophecy in ancient politics wasn't about predicting the future, it was about inventing it. Picture this. A king facing rebellion could either send his army to crush dissent or have his priests announce that the gods themselves had ordained his rule. Which do you think left a deeper mark on people's minds? Across civilizations, from the Nile to the Tigris, rulers recognized that divine approval was far more persuasive than brute force alone. Take the pharaohs of Egypt, who didn't just build pyramids, they built myths. Every inscription on their temples proclaimed them as living gods, their victories foretold by celestial signs, their enemies doomed by heavenly decree. This wasn't vanity, it was viral marketing, ancient style. The real genius lay in the ambiguity. Ancient prophecies were masterclasses in vagueness, designed to fit any outcome. When the Oracle of Delphi told King Croesus that crossing a river would destroy a great empire, she didn't specify whose empire. His confident invasion led to his own downfall, yet the oracle's reputation only grew. This was the perfect political tool, flexible enough to explain any result, sacred enough to silence doubt. Rulers didn't need to control events, just the story around them. After a bad harvest, a sign the gods demanded loyalty, a military loss, proof that traitors had angered the divine. There was always a prophecy to fit the narrative, or one that could be discovered just in time. But the most powerful prophecies weren't just spoken, they were staged. Roman emperors were particularly adept at this political theater. When Augustus needed public support, his court astrologer conveniently predicted his rise from obscurity to power, complete with celestial omens. Coins minted across the empire carried these prophecies, turning superstition into state propaganda. The message was clear: resistance wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. And in societies where the spiritual and political worlds were deeply intertwined, that was a threat more terrifying than any army. Priests and seers became the spin doctors of their day, often walking a tightrope between truth and power. The Babylonian king Nabonidus learned this the hard way when his attempts to promote the moon god over Marduk backfired. His own priests turned against him, circulating prophecies that his rule violated divine will, prophecies that conveniently supported his rival Cyrus the Great's invasion. This reveals prophecy's double edge. It could crown kings just as easily as topple them. The real power belonged not to those who believed the prophecies, but to those who controlled their interpretation. What made these manipulations so effective was how they tapped into fundamental human psychology. People crave certainty, especially in uncertain times. By presenting chaos as part of a grand, predestined plan, rulers offered comfort alongside control. A rebellion wasn't random violence, it was the fulfillment of some long-hidden oracle. A new dynasty wasn't a coup, it was the gods correcting their own divine order. This psychological alchemy turned fear into faith, and faith into obedience. The brilliance of ancient political prophecy wasn't in its magic, but in its understanding of how easily divine authority could be manufactured, and how desperately people would cling to it. The parallels to modern power structures are striking. While we may not consult animal entrails today, the core strategy remains: shape the narrative and you shape reality. Ancient rulers simply understood something we sometimes forget, that the stories we tell about why things happen are often more powerful than the events themselves. Their prophecies were the original fake news, the primordial post-truth politics. And just like today, the most dangerous lies weren't those that deceived people, but those they wanted to believe. If there was one golden rule in ancient power plays, it was this: when the gods don't give you an endorsement, forge one. Across empires, rulers mastered the art of manufacturing prophecies, turning shaky claims to power into divine destiny. Take Alexander the Great, who didn't just conquer lands, he conquered the narrative. After seizing Egypt, he visited the Oracle of Siwa, where priests suddenly remembered an ancient prophecy declaring him the son of Zeus. Coincidence? Hardly. This wasn't just flattery, it was political genius. By aligning himself with the gods, Alexander transformed from a foreign invader into a liberator, his rule framed as a cosmic inevitability rather than a military conquest. Rome's first emperor, Augustus, took fabrication to new heights. His rise followed a bloody civil war, leaving his legitimacy fragile. So his inner circle circulated a lost prophecy from the Sibylline books, claiming a golden child would bring peace to Rome, conveniently matching Augustus's reign. Poets like Virgil wove these themes into epic tales, blurring the line between myth and reality, until even skeptics wondered if the stars had ordained his rule. The brilliance: these prophecies were never too specific, vague enough to fit any outcome, yet authoritative enough to silence dissent. When your critics argue with you, they're just arguing with fate. But perhaps the most audacious example comes from Persia. King Cyrus the Great, facing an uphill battle to legitimize his rule over Babylon, had his scribes pen the Cyrus Cylinder, a supposed divine decree naming him as the god's chosen restorer of order. The catch: it was written after he'd already taken the city. This wasn't prophecy, it was publicity. By retroactively scripting his divine mandate, Cyrus turned a power grab into a holy mission, a tactic so effective that modern occupiers would later mimic it. The real power of these fabrications lay in their psychological grip. People didn't just believe these prophecies, they needed to. In a world of plagues, invasions, and droughts, the idea that someone, even a king, had the god's blueprint offered comfort. Rulers exploited this craving for order, wrapping their ambitions in celestial certainty. When the Babylonian king Nabopolassar rebelled against Assyria, he didn't just raise an army, he circulated, rediscovered tablets predicting Assyria's fall centuries earlier. His victory wasn't luck, it was destiny fulfilled, yet the risk of backfire was ever present. The same prophecies used to crown kings could dethrone them. When Emperor Nero's reign grew tyrannical, opponents dusted off old oracles hinting at a lyre-playing destroyer, suddenly applying them to the musically inclined Nero. The lesson: fabricated prophecies were a double-edged sword, useful until someone sharper wielded them against you. What made them irresistible wasn't their truth, but their power to make the unthinkable feel inevitable. And that, in the end, was the real magic. The Oracle of Delphi didn't just speak for the gods, she spoke for the highest bidder. Behind the sacred smoke and cryptic verses, ancient oracles were often political puppets, their prophecies carefully curated to serve those in power. Take the legendary Croesus of Lydia, who famously tested multiple oracles before trusting Delphi. What he didn't know, the priests had spies across Greece, gathering intelligence so their prophecies could be tailored to his ambitions. When he asked whether to attack Persia, the oracle's reply that he would destroy a great empire was a masterclass in manipulation. Croesus assumed it meant Persia's downfall, but the empire that fell was his own. The lesson: oracles didn't predict the future, they shaped it through calculated ambiguity. Delphi's prestige made it a prime target for interference. City-states and kings donated lavishly to the temple, not out of piety but to buy influence. Athens alone built a treasury on Delphi's sacred grounds, a not-so-subtle reminder of where the oracle's loyalties should lie. When Sparta needed divine backing for its wars, its leaders suddenly discovered ancient prophecies in Delphi's archives, conveniently endorsing their campaigns. Even the oracle's famed trances weren't beyond suspicion. Historical accounts hint that the Pythia, the priestess who channeled Apollo's words, might have inhaled ethylene gas from fissures in the temple floor, a chemical nudge to ensure her visions aligned with political needs. But Delphi was just the tip of the iceberg. In Egypt, pharaohs handpicked the priests of Ammon, ensuring the god's pronouncements matched royal decrees. When Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's few female pharaohs, needed to legitimize her rule, she commissioned a divine revelation where Ammon himself declared her his daughter. The carving still stands at Karnak Temple, a god crowning a mortal with priests as the invisible scriptwriters. Similarly, in Babylon, the priesthood of Marduk operated like a state propaganda office. Kings consulted the god before major decisions, but the temple's inner circle ensured the answers favored the throne or risked losing their lucrative positions. The most brazen manipulation happened when rulers cut out the middlemen entirely. Roman emperors, wary of Delphi's independence, created their own state-approved oracles. The Sibylline books, Rome's most sacred prophecies, were kept under lock and key by a hand-picked priesthood. When an emperor needed public support, verses mysteriously appeared, predicting his triumphs or warning against his enemies. Emperor Augustus went further, appointing his own personal astrologer, Thrasyllus, whose celestial insights always seemed to justify imperial policies. The message was clear: the gods spoke through the emperor's chosen channels, or not at all. Yet this control wasn't foolproof. Oracles could become liabilities if their independence threatened the narrative. When the Pythia once dared to suggest that King Philip of Macedon's expansion was against Apollo's will, his response was swift. He bribed the temple's administrators to replace her with a more compliant priestess. In Persia, the Magi, a priestly class, were so notorious for twisting prophecies that the word magic became synonymous with deception. The line between divine messenger and political operative was often indistinguishable. What made this system so effective was its veneer of impartiality. People believed oracles precisely because they seemed beyond human influence. Rulers exploited that trust, turning sacred sites into echo chambers for their agendas. The real power wasn't in the prophecies themselves, but in controlling who interpreted them and who got to whisper in the ear of the gods. Nothing cemented a ruler's authority like a well-timed act of divine theater. Omens weren't just observed, they were orchestrated, turning the natural world into a stage for political propaganda. Take the legendary Reign of Blood in ancient Rome. When the Senate needed to justify a controversial war, red dye was allegedly poured into public fountains, creating panic until priests declared it a sign from the gods demanding action. This wasn't superstition, it was spectacle, designed to transform skepticism into fervent belief. The art of omen manipulation relied on two ingredients: plausibility and drama. A sudden eclipse could be framed as heaven's disapproval of a rival, while a flock of birds flying in the wrong direction might signal divine favor for a new law. In Mesopotamia, kings employed teams of haruspices specialists in reading animal entrails, whose interpretations always seemed to align with royal agendas. The liver of a sacrificed sheep wasn't just an organ, it was a script, its messages carefully decoded to suit the needs of the throne. Even the weather became a political tool. When the Chinese Emperor Wu of Han faced rebellion, court astronomers declared a comet's appearance as proof his enemies had angered the heavens. The rebellion collapsed soon after, not from military defeat, but from the psychological weight of fighting fate. Some omens were so brazen they bordered on dark comedy. The Roman Emperor Nero, accused of starting the Great Fire of Rome, reportedly sang while the city burned. Facing backlash, his advisors quickly discovered prophecies predicting the fire as punishment for Rome's moral decay, shifting blame onto persecuted Christians instead. Similarly, when the Babylonian king Nabonidus returned from exile, his supporters staged a celestial miracle, claiming the moon god Sin had darkened the sky to herald his restoration. The truth, they'd likely timed the announcement with an actual lunar eclipse, exploiting public awe to legitimize his return. But the most effective omens played on deep cultural fears. In Egypt, the pharaoh's claim to control the Nile's annual flood wasn't just about agriculture, it was about power. By positioning themselves as intermediaries who ensured the floods and thus survival, they turned a natural cycle into proof of divine mandate. Failures were spun as tests of faith, while abundant harvests became rewards for loyalty. The Aztecs took this further, interpreting earthquakes or droughts as signs the gods demanded more human sacrifices, conveniently reinforcing both religious and political hierarchies. What made these staged omens so potent was their unpredictability. Unlike static prophecies carved on temple walls, omens were fleeting and visceral. A miraculous meteor shower couldn't be fact-checked. A divinely sent plague left no room for debate. Rulers understood that fear and wonder clouded judgment, making people desperate for explanations they were all too ready to provide. The line between observation and manipulation blurred until even the most skeptical citizens wondered, was that thunder just weather or the gods speaking? Yet the risk of overplaying their hand was ever present. When the Seleucid king Antiochus Roman IV staged a fake divine apparition at the Olympic Games using hidden mirrors to create a glowing statue, the backlash was swift. The crowd, feeling duped, turned against him, proving that even ancient audiences had limits to their credulity. The most successful rulers balanced spectacle with subtlety, letting their subjects connect the dots themselves. After all, the best illusions are those where people convince themselves they've seen the truth. History wasn't just written by the victors, it was rewritten by the prophets. Ancient rulers perfected the art of retroactive prophecy, where past events didn't just happen, they were foretold. Imagine a king returning from battle, his victory secured not by strategy alone, but by the sudden discovery of a centuries-old tablet predicting his triumph down to the last detail. This wasn't coincidence, it was political alchemy, turning raw power into divine inevitability. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon mastered this tactic after seizing Babylon in the 7th century BC. His scribes unearthed an inscription allegedly written by his grandfather, Sennacherib, prophesying that a future king would rebuild Babylon's temples, conveniently justifying Esarhaddon's reconstruction campaign. The brilliance, by backdating legitimacy, he made rebellion seem like defiance of ancestral and divine will. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Pharaoh Hormheb erased his predecessor's name from monuments, replacing it with claims that oracles had long warned of Akhenaten's heresy. The past became clay, reshaped to fit the present's narrative. Rome took this further with the Carmen Seculaire, a lost prophecy rediscovered during Augustus's reign, claiming a golden age would begin under a virtuous leader. Poets like Horace wove these themes into literature until fiction blurred with history. Even Virgil's Aeneid served as propaganda, tracing Augustus's lineage to Aeneas, as if the empire's founding was always destined. The message, Rome wasn't built in a day, it was built in prophecy. China's dynasties played the same game. When the Tang Emperor Taizong usurped the throne, his scholars combed through ancient texts until they found a line about a sage from the northwest, a perfect match for his origins. The mandate of heaven wasn't just claimed, it was retrofitted. Similarly, the Zhou dynasty justified overthrowing the Shang by circulating older divinations accusing the Shang of moral decay. The trick, prophecies only gained authority after the fact, like a cosmic rubber stamp on conquest, but the most audacious rewrites happened in Mesoamerica. Mayan kings would erect stelae stone monuments claiming their births were heralded by celestial signs years before they actually took power. One ruler, Yax Nun Ahin, even had scribes backdate a prophecy about his reign to his grandfather's era, creating a multi-generational destiny. The lesson: when you control the scribes, you control time itself. This manipulation worked because it exploited how memory functions. Human brains naturally reshape past events to fit present beliefs, a cognitive quirk rulers weaponized. By the time a new prophecy circulated, witnesses who might remember differently were often dead or silenced, and with no printing presses or internet, correcting the record was nearly impossible. The past became whatever the powerful needed it to be, a lesson modern propagandists still use today. The irony: these fabricated prophecies often became real history. Texts like the Sibylline oracles or the Bamboo Annals, initially political tools, were later studied as genuine artifacts. The lies of one era became the truths of another, proving that destiny isn't written in the stars, it's written by those who hold the pen. Fear was the invisible chain that bound ancient societies, and nothing tightened its grip like an unfulfilled prophecy. Rulers understood that a looming catastrophe, always just out of sight but never quite dispelled, could keep populations obedient far more effectively than any army. The Assyrian kings were masters of this psychological warfare. When conquering rebellious cities, they didn't just carve victory monuments, they circulated prophecies warning that resistance would unleash plagues, famine, or invasions by monstrous forces. These weren't empty threats, they were carefully crafted narratives designed to make submission feel like survival. Consider the Babylonian Marduk prophecy, a text that predicted cycles of chaos and restoration. Kings like Nebuchadnezzar II used it to frame their reigns as the only bulwark against impending doom. If they fell, the prophecy implied, the gods would abandon humanity to darkness. This tactic exploited a universal human instinct, the fear of uncertainty. By keeping the prophecy's fulfillment just out of reach, always contingent on continued loyalty, rulers turned themselves into indispensable guardians of order. Disobedience wasn't just treason, it was cosmic sabotage. The Greeks refined this strategy with Delphi's darker oracles. Before major wars, city-states would receive ambiguous warnings. A great house will fall, or the unrighteous will drown in their own blood. The vagueness was deliberate. No matter the outcome, the prophecy could be reinterpreted to punish dissenters. After Sparta's defeat at Leuctra, their enemies claimed it fulfilled an old oracle about the dancing wolves meeting their end, a verse no one had taken seriously until it was politically useful. Rome weaponized fear through the Sibylline book's direst passages. When social unrest threatened the aristocracy, senators would consult the books, inevitably discovering warnings that only strict hierarchy could avert disaster. Emperor Tiberius took this further, using astrologers to spread rumors that his death would trigger a celestial apocalypse. The result, even his enemies hesitated to move against him, fearing they'd doom more than just an empire. But the most chilling examples came from Mesoamerica. Aztec rulers declared that the sun itself would stop rising unless human hearts fed the gods, a prophecy that justified endless sacrifices to maintain their power. The brilliance of this fear-based control was its self-perpetuating nature. The more people sacrificed, the more they believed in the prophecy's truth, and the harder it became to question the system. The irony, these prophecies often became self-fulfilling. When rebellions did erupt, rulers pointed to them as proof the prophecy was unfolding, ignoring their own role in creating the conditions for unrest. Fear didn't just preserve power, it disguised its failures, and in that gap between dread and deliverance, ancient kings found their most enduring weapon, the power to make people fear freedom more than tyranny. In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the temple of Jupiter, lay a weapon more potent than any sword, the Sibylline books. These ancient scrolls, supposedly purchased from a mysterious prophetess by Rome's last king, were meant to guide the Republic through crises with divine wisdom. But by the time emperors ruled, they'd become something far more pragmatic, a political playbook disguised as prophecy. Imagine a Senate chamber where, instead of debating policy, leaders simply consulted these sacred texts only to miraculously find verses endorsing whatever agenda they'd already decided upon. The Sibylline books didn't predict Rome's future, they rubber-stamped it. Augustus, the first emperor, set the tone for how these prophecies would be wielded. Facing resistance to his radical reforms, he ordered the books reinterpreted, suddenly revealing passages that demanded moral renewal, conveniently aligning with his laws regulating marriage and family life. When he needed public support for his costly wars, priests discovered warnings that Rome would fall unless its borders expanded. The genius of this system. No one could challenge it. To question the Sibylline books was to question the gods themselves, but the real manipulation lay in selective consultation. Emperors only opened these sacred texts when it suited them, ignoring crises that didn't fit their narratives. Nero famously avoided consulting the books during the Great Fire of Rome, fearing their verses might blame him. Yet when he later persecuted Christians, his cronies suddenly found prophecies about false cults corrupting the city. Even natural disasters became political opportunities. When a plague struck under Marcus Aurelius, the Senate declared the Sibylline books demanded the revival of long-forgotten rituals that just happened to reinforce traditional values the emperor was promoting. The priesthood guarding these texts operated less like holy men and more like modern PR teams. Historical records suggest verses were often updated to reflect current events. After Rome's disastrous defeat at Cannae, priests added lines about a great leader rising from darkness, a handy prophecy later applied to Scipio Africanus. Centuries later, when Constantine wanted to shift Rome toward Christianity, his supporters quietly edited the books to include vague references to a new dawn and a shepherd of men. The line between divine revelation and political editing blurred until it vanished entirely. What made this system so effective was its built-in deniability. Unlike oracles whose pronouncements were public, the Sibylline books were kept under lock and key, their contents revealed only in carefully curated excerpts. This secrecy allowed emperors to manufacture crises or solutions as needed. When Caligula demanded divine honors, his opponents couldn't even check if the books truly contained prophecies supporting his madness. They had to take the priest's word for it. And those priests, they knew which side their bread was buttered on. Yet the greatest irony came when the books themselves fell victim to the chaos they'd been used to justify. During the civil wars that preceded Augustus's rise, a fire destroyed the original Sibylline scrolls. The replacements were hastily compiled from fragments and memories, meaning even Rome's most sacred prophecies were, in the end, as much a reconstruction as the empire itself. The mandate of heaven wasn't just a royal title, it was the ultimate political gamble. Imagine ruling an empire where your divine right to power could vanish overnight, not because of armies or votes, but because the heavens themselves seemed to withdraw their favor. This was the precarious reality for Chinese emperors, who didn't just wear crowns, they balanced them on the edge of a celestial knife. The Zhou dynasty first coined the term in the 11th century BCE after overthrowing the Shang, claiming their victory wasn't rebellion but the fulfillment of a cosmic shift. The message was clear: the gods didn't just approve of their rule, they demanded it. But here's the catch: the mandate was always conditional. Natural disasters, famines, or military defeats weren't just setbacks, they were potential signs the heavens had changed their mind. When the Yellow River flooded catastrophically during the Qin dynasty, rebels didn't just blame poor engineering, they declared it proof the emperor had lost divine favor. Even more ingenious, the rebels circulated prophetic songs among peasants, predicting a red dragon would rise from the east, a perfect match for their leader's banner color. The Qin fell, and the Han dynasty rose, its founders quickly commissioning historians to document how omens had foretold their ascent for centuries. The Tang dynasty took manipulation further. Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own name, faced constant challenges to her legitimacy. Her solution: a meticulously staged discovery of a massive stone tablet in a river, inscribed with ancient characters declaring a sage mother would usher in a golden age. Court scholars suddenly remembered old texts referencing this prophecy, while Buddhist monks whom Wu had generously funded declared her an incarnation of the Maitreya Buddha. The mandate wasn't just claimed, it was manufactured through scripture, spectacle, and strategic silence. Yet the system's genius lay in its circular logic. A successful rebellion didn't disprove the mandate, it confirmed the old ruler had lost it. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty collapsed, Ming propagandists unearthed prophecies about a radiant warrior born under a southern star, conveniently matching their founder Zhu Yuanzhang's birthplace. The very chaos that toppled dynasties became evidence of their moral failure, while victors framed their rise as destiny fulfilled. The mandate wasn't a shield against overthrow, it was the playbook for justifying it. This created a paradox. The same doctrine that legitimized emperors also empowered their enemies. Secret societies like the White Lotus Rebellion didn't just amass weapons, they circulated folk prophecies about a child of light who would restore the true mandate. Even foreign conquerors played the game. When the Manchu king took power, they didn't erase the concept, they rebranded it, claiming their victory proved heaven favored their benevolent alien rule. The mandate became a linguistic chameleon, its meaning shifting with every new throne. What made this system so enduring was its adaptability. Unlike Europe's rigid divine right of kings, China's mandate acknowledged that power could and should change hands when rulers failed. It turned political upheaval into a cosmic reset button, offering hope that no tyranny was permanent. But this flexibility came at a cost. Emperors lived in constant fear of signs and portents, pouring resources into astrologers and diviners not to predict the future, but to control its narrative. The mandate didn't just govern China, it haunted its rulers, a reminder that today's divine sovereign could be tomorrow's fallen pretender with just one unlucky eclipse. The night sky wasn't just a canvas of stars for ancient rulers, it was a script waiting to be written. Astrology in royal courts had little to do with genuine cosmic insight, and everything to do with staging the ultimate celestial endorsement. Take Emperor Tiberius of Rome, who kept a personal astrologer on the island of Capri, not to guide his decisions, but to craft star charts that proved his reign was divinely ordained. When a rival's birth chart suggested potential ambition, Tiberius didn't wait for rebellion, he eliminated the threat, then had his astrologers declare the act was written in the stars. The message, even the heavens obeyed his will. In Persia, the Sasanian kings elevated astrology to state policy. Before launching military campaigns, court astronomers would meticulously calculate planetary positions until they found a configuration that predicted victory. If Mars was favorably aligned, the campaign proceeded. If not, dates were adjusted until the stars complied. This wasn't science, it was cosmic propaganda. The real power lay in the illusion of inevitability. When soldiers believed their charge was backed by Jupiter's blessing, they fought with the fervor of men who thought destiny itself marched beside them. But the masters of astrological manipulation were the Mughal emperors of India. Akbar the Great didn't just consult horoscopes, he engineered them. When his son Jahangir was born, Akbar's astronomers adjusted the birth time by precisely calculated minutes to ensure the planets formed a rare royal yoga configuration. The resulting chart, still studied today as a masterpiece of celestial geometry, was less a snapshot of the heavens than a carefully edited portrait. Even the construction of Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's capital, followed astrological blueprints, with every gate and courtyard aligned to constellations that symbolized imperial power. The Byzantine court took this theater to surreal extremes. Empress Theodora, once an actress, understood spectacle better than anyone. When her husband Justinian faced the Nika riots, their court astrologer staged a public reading of the stars, declaring that Saturn's position guaranteed the rebels' defeat. The next day, Justinian's troops massacred thousands in the Hippodrome, an act reframed not as brutality, but as cosmic justice. The brilliance of such manipulations lay in their unfalsifiability. Failed predictions were dismissed as misinterpretations, while lucky guesses became proof of divine favor. China's imperial astronomers operated with even higher stakes. The Forbidden Cities Observatory wasn't just a scientific institution, it was a political weapon. Only state-sanctioned star readings were permitted, with private astrology punishable by death. Why? Because celestial omens like guest stars, supernova, or planetary conjunctions could challenge the emperor's mandate of heaven. When a comet appeared during the Han Dynasty, court astronomers quickly declared it a broom star sweeping away corruption, just as the emperor was purging his rivals. The stars didn't guide power, they justified it. Yet the darkest twist came from Renaissance Europe, where popes and kings employed astrologers while publicly condemning the practice. Catherine de' Medici's court astrologer, Nostradamus, famously couched political forecasts in cryptic verses that could be reinterpreted endlessly. His prediction about the young lion overcoming the old was suddenly remembered when her son defeated a rival in battle. This duality, public skepticism, private reliance, revealed astrology's true role, not as a guide to truth, but as a hall of mirrors where rulers could refract reality to their liking. What made these celestial charades so effective was their universality. Unlike localized oracles, the stars were visible to all, creating a shared language of power. When a Babylonian king pointed to Jupiter hovering near the moon and called it Marduk's approval, his subjects from Susa to Nineveh saw the same proof in their skies. The celestial stage was the one theater where every citizen had a seat, yet only the royal scriptwriters controlled the script. The legacy of this astrological manipulation lingers in unexpected ways. Modern leaders may not consult star charts, but the urge to frame political acts as historically inevitable or scientifically justified follows the same playbook. The stars have changed, but the staging remains a reminder that when power seeks legitimacy, it will always find a sky to paint its truths upon. The battlefield wasn't always won with swords and shields. Sometimes the most devastating weapons were whispered words dressed as divine truth. Ancient rulers understood that prophecies could cripple an enemy's morale long before the first arrow flew. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib marched on Jerusalem in the 7th century BC, he didn't just bring siege engines, he brought psychological warfare. His envoys stood outside the city walls, shouting prophecies, claiming the Hebrew god Yahweh had abandoned the Jews and ordained Assyrian victory. The goal: to turn faith into fear, making defenders question whether resistance was even worth the cost. This tactic reached its zenith with the Persians. Cyrus the Great didn't just conquer Babylon in 539 BC, he convinced its people they'd already lost. Months before his army arrived, his agents circulated ancient tablets predicting Babylon's fall as punishment for its king's impiety. By the time Cyrus entered the city, many Babylonians greeted him as a liberator fulfilling destiny, not an invader. The real stroke of genius, Cyrus then issued a decree, purportedly foretold by these same prophecies, freeing exiled peoples and restoring their temples. His victory wasn't just military, it was mythological. The Greeks refined this art into a science. Before the Battle of Salamis, Athenian commanders spread rumors that the Oracle of Delphi had secretly predicted a wooden wall would save Greece. When their triremes, literal wooden walls, crushed the Persian fleet, the prophecy became self-fulfilling propaganda. Later, Alexander the Great took it further. Facing the impregnable fortress of Tyre, he had his seers recall an old prediction that Tyre would fall when the sea retreated. Weeks later, his engineers built a causeway turning the island city into a peninsula, and Alexander framed it as destiny, not engineering. Rome weaponized prophecy on an industrial scale. During the Punic Wars, senators paid poets to compose Sibylline verses, warning that Carthage's existence threatened Jupiter's favor. These weren't just poems, they were psychological munitions, dropped into the public consciousness until Romans believed annihilation of Carthage wasn't just strategy, but sacred duty. Centuries later, when Constantine needed to unite his troops against Maxentius, his advisors rediscovered a prophecy about victory under the heavenly sign. The Chi Rho symbol appeared on shields, and at the Milvian Bridge, soldiers fought with the fervor of men who thought the Christian God had already chosen their side. The darkest brilliance of these manipulations lay in their irrefutability. A failed prophecy could always be reinterpreted. A successful one needed no explanation. When the Mongol warlord Timur besieged Damascus in 1400, he didn't just encircle the city, he circulated a verse supposedly from the Quran predicting its fall when the stars bled. As flaming projectiles streaked across the night sky like crimson comets, defenders saw not artillery but apocalypse. Resistance crumbled within days. Yet this psychological warfare had a fatal flaw. It cut both ways. The same prophecies used to demoralize enemies could backfire if belief faltered. When the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II heard Spanish ships matched an old prediction about floating towers, his initial paralysis allowed Cortés a critical foothold. And when Napoleon's propagandists spread astrological predictions of his invincibility, the disastrous Russian campaign exposed the gamble, turning celestial certainty into a joke. What made these tactics endure wasn't their infallibility, but their adaptability. A prophecy didn't need to be true, it needed to be believed long enough to shape reality. In that gap between prediction and outcome, ancient rulers found their most potent weapon, not control of land or gold, but of the stories people told themselves about what was possible. And sometimes that was enough to make the impossible inevitable. Even the most carefully spun prophecies could unravel, sometimes spectacularly. Take Nero, Rome's infamous emperor, who spent years curating his own divine narrative. Astrologers proclaimed his birth chart marked him as destined for greatness, while court poets wove his reign into ancient Sibylline prophecies. But when Rome burned in 64 CE, the illusion cracked. Rumors spread that Nero had fiddled while the city burned, a story likely exaggerated, but one that stuck because it fit another, darker prophecy, the so-called last king of Rome who would bring ruin. Nero's enemies seized on this, circulating whispers that he was the tyrant foretold by the gods. His desperate attempts to blame Christians only made him look guiltier. In the end, even his own gods abandoned him, convinced the stars had revoked their favor. The man who'd manipulated fate died alone, declared a public enemy by the very prophecies he'd once weaponized. Babylon's last king, Nabonidus, faced a similar reckoning. A devout worshipper of the moon god Sin, he replaced Babylon's traditional patron deity, Marduk, with his own preferred god, and then commissioned rediscovered tablets claiming this shift had been prophesied centuries earlier. But the priesthood of Marduk wasn't fooled. Secretly, they began interpreting omens to favor Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, advancing on their borders. By the time Cyrus arrived, the priests declared him the true fulfillment of Babylon's ancient prophecies, painting Nabonidus as a heretic who'd angered the gods. The result, Babylon opened its gates without a fight, and Nabonidus's own propaganda became the script for his downfall. Sometimes the backlash was more literal. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II inherited a tradition of prophecy manipulation, with priests carefully tailoring omens to justify conquests and sacrifices. But when Spanish ships appeared in 1519, their sails resembling the floating towers of an old prediction about catastrophe, the system turned against him. Moctezuma hesitated, convinced resistance might defy the gods. His indecision gave Cortés critical time to forge alliances with the Aztecs' enemies. The irony. The prophecy Moctezuma feared may have been planted years earlier by dissident priests unhappy with his rule. The very tools of control became the seeds of collapse. Not all failures were so dramatic. In medieval Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II staked his legitimacy on astrological prophecies, even timing his coronation to a kingly alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. But when his wars faltered, opponents dusted off older predictions about an eagle pierced by arrows, suddenly applying them to Frederick's heraldic symbol. His celestial certainty became a punchline, undermining his authority until even allies questioned whether the stars had ever truly been on his side. The common thread, prophecy manipulation, relied on consensus, the shared belief that the gods spoke through kings and priests. Once that trust fractured, the magic dissipated. When the Han Chinese Emperor Wang Mang tried to justify his usurpation with fabricated omens, peasants revolted under banners quoting different prophecies about the return of the true dragon. His reign collapsed in riots and floods, which critics gleefully declared were the heavens' judgment. Perhaps the most poetic failure belonged to the French Revolution's would-be prophets. As monarchy crumbled, radicals like Catherine Theot claimed ancient texts predicted a new age of reason dawning in 1795. But when the promised utopia failed to materialize, the revolutionaries, who'd built their movement on rejecting superstition, found themselves mocked for the very mysticism they despised in kings. The cycle came full circle. Those who tried to harness fate became its cautionary tales. The lesson wasn't that prophecies held no power, it was that their power was always borrowed. Rulers could bend destiny only as long as people believed the bend was real. And when that belief shattered, so too did the illusions of those who thought they'd written the script. The whispers of ancient oracles may have faded, but their echoes still shape our world today, just wrapped in modern packaging. Consider how often we hear phrases like, "History will judge," or "The arc of justice bends inevitably toward progress." These aren't just poetic turns of phrase, they're 21st century versions of the divine mandate, designed to make certain outcomes feel preordained rather than contested. Politicians don't need priestly intermediaries anymore. They have polling data, focus groups, and viral algorithms that serve the same purpose, crafting narratives that frame their agenda as the natural, unavoidable next step. Take the concept of technological inevitability. Silicon Valley giants routinely declare that advancements like AI or facial recognition are unstoppable forces, as if resisting them would be like fighting gravity. This mirrors how Babylonian kings claimed their conquests were written in the stars, shifting debate from "should we do this" to "how quickly should we surrender to the future." Even the language is eerily similar. When a tech CEO says disruption is destiny, they're channeling the same rhetorical playbook as Augustus commissioning prophecies about Rome's golden age. Media, too, has mastered the art of manufactured certainty. News cycles thrive on tipping points and historic crossroads, turning complex events into simplified arcs of fate. During elections, pundits declare candidates unstoppable or doomed based on selective data, creating self-fulfilling prophecies much like the Sibylline book's curated verses. Remember how red states and blue states became entrenched not just through voting patterns, but through endless repetition of the idea that political allegiances were fixed and unchangeable. That's not analysis, it's modern haruspicy, reading entrails of polling margins to declare what's meant to be. Even activism isn't immune. Movements frame their goals as the right side of history, a phrase that carries the same weight as the mandate of heaven. It's no accident that climate change campaigns emphasize last chances and point of no return, language designed to trigger the same primal urgency as ancient warnings about omens and droughts. The tools have changed, but the psychology remains identical. When people believe an outcome is inevitable, they're more likely to either rally behind it or resign themselves to it. Yet the darkest parallel lies in fear-based manipulation. Just as Assyrian kings used prophecies of doom to justify preemptive wars, modern leaders invoke existential threats to bypass scrutiny. The phrase, "there is no alternative," has greenlit everything from austerity measures to surveillance laws, silencing dissent by framing critics as delusional, or worse, as enemies of progress. It's the unfulfilled prophecy tactic reborn. Keep the catastrophe vague enough to be perpetual, and the public will trade freedom for the illusion of safety. But here's the twist. Just like in antiquity, today's inevitability narratives are often illusions. The end of history, proclaimed after the Cold War, collapsed under new conflicts. Permanent economic booms evaporated overnight. This volatility reveals the truth. Inevitability is always a story, not a law. The real power lies in recognizing when we're being sold destiny, and remembering that the future, like the past, is written by those daring enough to question the script. Spotting a manufactured prophecy isn't about debunking the supernatural. It's about recognizing the fingerprints of power on the narrative, the first red flag. Vagueness dressed as profundity. Ancient rulers loved prophecies that could mean anything, like the Delphic oracle's famous reply to King Croesus: "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." It sounded dire, but which empire? The answer only became clear after his defeat, a classic trick still used today. Modern equivalents might be pundits predicting a major shift coming or unprecedented events ahead. The less specific the claim, the safer it is for the prophet, and the more useful for those pulling the strings. Another tell is retroactive fulfillment. Ancient kings were notorious for discovering prophecies after events occurred. When the Roman Emperor Vespasian needed legitimacy after a civil war, his supporters dug up an obscure oracle about a man from the east bringing peace, suddenly applied to his campaign in Judea. Today, this plays out when politicians or media declare, "This was always inevitable," reframing messy realities as preordained outcomes. If a prophecy fits too neatly after the fact, question who stitched the narrative together. Timing is another giveaway. Manipulated prophecies often appear at suspiciously convenient moments, like the Reign of Blood, staged by Roman senators to justify a war, or the sudden, celestial omens Chinese emperors produced during succession crises. Modern parallels include leaked polls before elections or expert predictions, timed to sway public opinion. When divine or data-driven, signs align too perfectly with someone's agenda, ask who set the clock. Watch for contradictions too. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's library held prophecies claiming both his eternal rule and the fall of his enemies until those enemies won, and the same tablets were reinterpreted as warnings about his arrogance. Today, you might hear a leader's policies hailed as historically necessary until they fail, at which point critics call them doomed from the start. The script flips, but the playwright stays the same. Finally, follow the money or the power. In Babylon, priests who delivered unfavorable prophecies often found themselves replaced. In Renaissance Europe, court astrologers who predicted a monarch's downfall rarely kept their heads. Today, think of how certain, inevitable trends in tech or finance just happen to benefit those funding the studies. When the reward for accurate prophecy aligns too neatly with the prophet's patrons, skepticism is your best ally. The greatest defense against manipulated fate isn't cynicism, it's curiosity. Ask who benefits from the story, who gets silenced by it, and what alternatives vanish when we accept it as truth. Because the oldest trick of power isn't controlling the future. It's convincing everyone else the future was never theirs to shape. Beneath the grand temples and celestial omens, a quiet ethical battle raged, one that ancient rulers rarely acknowledged, but that shaped empires as surely as any sword. Was manipulating prophecy a necessary tool for stability or the ultimate betrayal of public trust? The answer depends on who you asked. Some leaders genuinely believed they served a higher purpose. The Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven wasn't just propaganda, it was a social contract. Emperors like Taizong of the Tang dynasty argued that fabricating omens of divine favor helped unify fractured regions, preventing chaos. In their eyes, bending fate was no different than a doctor hiding bitter medicine in honey. The deception served the greater good, but for every ruler who saw themselves as stewards of order, there were those who wielded prophecy like a thief's lockpick. Take Emperor Nero, who twisted the Sibylline books to justify persecuting Christians, or the Aztec elite who used dire predictions to demand endless human sacrifices. These weren't acts of governance but exploitation, turning spiritual awe into a currency of fear. The Maya king Waxaclajun Abakayawil took it further, erecting stelae that retroactively predicted his victories, not to inspire his people, but to erase dissent by making his rule seem cosmically inevitable. The moral gray areas are where this debate gets hauntingly modern. Consider the Roman practice of interpretatio Romana, where conquered people's gods were recast as Roman deities, a spiritual branding exercise. Was this cultural genocide or pragmatic diplomacy? Similarly, when medieval European kings claimed astrological alignments justified their wars, were they deluded believers or cynical manipulators? The line blurred further in places like Egypt, where pharaohs like Hatshepsut used divine visions to legitimize her unprecedented female rule, a lie that arguably advanced gender equality in a patriarchal system. Today's parallels force us to confront uncomfortable questions. When politicians invoke historical inevitability to push policies, or corporations claim technology's march can't be stopped, they're playing the same game as Babylonian priests. The stakes are identical. Surrender your autonomy to those who claim to speak for forces beyond your understanding. Yet ancient history also offers warnings. The more rulers leaned on fabricated fate, the more brittle their power became, because when people finally saw the strings, the illusion didn't just fade, it shattered. Perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in accountability. The Zhou dynasty justified overthrowing the Shang by accusing them of ignoring heavenly signs, only to fall centuries later by the same logic. Every system that treats truth as disposable eventually becomes disposable itself. In the end, the ethics of prophecy manipulation boil down to a simple test. Are you using destiny to uplift or to enslave? Because history's harshest verdicts weren't written by the gods, they were delivered by the people who finally stopped believing in them. The Trojan War might never have happened without one fateful prophecy, or the clever way it was manipulated. According to legend, the oracle at Delphi warned King Priam of Troy that his newborn son Paris would bring the city's destruction. But here's the twist: when Paris survived infancy and returned as a prince, Priam's court reinterpreted the prophecy, claiming it meant he'd bring greatness. Their selective memory cost them everything. Paris's abduction of Helen sparked the war, and Troy burned, proof that even the most dire predictions could be twisted until they backfired spectacularly. Centuries later, another prophecy altered the course of Europe: Joan of Arc's visions. A teenage peasant girl claiming to hear saints might have been dismissed, but her prediction that the Dauphin would be crowned at Reims struck a nerve. The French court, desperate to turn the tide against England, seized on her claims. But was Joan divinely inspired, or a pawn in a propaganda war? Historical records suggest her visions aligned suspiciously well with the political needs of Charles VII's faction. Her martyrdom cemented her legend, but the truth may be stranger. Her prophecies succeeded because they were useful, not because they were sacred. Then there's the chilling case of the dies irae prophecy in medieval Rome. When Emperor Otto III sought to revive the glory of ancient Rome, a monk named Bernward circulated a verse predicting a last emperor who'd rule before the apocalypse, conveniently matching Otto's reforms. The prophecy fueled Otto's ambitions until his sudden death at 22, after which critics declared that the real fulfillment, his hubris, had hastened doom. The lesson: prophecies could crown kings or bury them depending on who controlled the narrative. In China, the Book of Changes wasn't just a divination tool, it was a political weapon. When the Tang dynasty faced rebellion, court scholars interpreted its hexagrams to predict victory, boosting morale until the tide turned. But the same book later justified the dynasty's collapse, as rebels claimed it foretold their rise. Like a celestial Rorschach test, its vague symbols meant whatever power needed them to mean. Perhaps the most enduring is the Prophecy of the Popes, attributed to the 12th century Saint Malachi. It listed vague descriptors for future popes like flower of flowers or from the middle of the moon. For centuries, Vatican insiders whispered that these predictions guided papal elections until critics noted the original document likely surfaced after most popes it described had already reigned. The ultimate retroactive prophecy, it proved how easily history could be edited to fit a convenient script. What unites these examples isn't their supernatural origins, but their human fingerprints. Whether delivered by oracles, saints, or scholars, the prophecies that shaped history did so because someone, often someone in power, found them too valuable to ignore. The real magic wasn't in foreseeing the future, but in convincing everyone else it was already written. Our brains are hardwired to crave stories where chaos has meaning, where random events connect into patterns that promise we're not at the mercy of chance. This isn't just philosophy, it's neuroscience. Studies show that when faced with uncertainty, the human prefrontal cortex lights up with distress, triggering what psychologists call pattern completion, the irresistible urge to fill gaps with narratives that make sense. Ancient rulers didn't just exploit this quirk, they weaponized it. A comet streaking across the night sky wasn't a random ice ball in space. It became a divine missive, interpreted by priests who knew exactly how to translate celestial chaos into political order. This craving for certainty runs deeper than culture, it's rooted in survival. Early humans who assumed rustling grass meant a predator, even when it was just the wind, lived to pass on their genes. Over millennia, that hypervigilance evolved into hyperconnectivity. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in static, and detect conspiracies in coincidence. Prophecies tap into this evolutionary glitch, offering the illusion that someone, somewhere, has decoded life's randomness. When Babylonian priests read the future in sheep livers, they weren't just performing rituals, they were selling the brain's favorite drug, the belief that nothing is accidental. But the real magic lies in dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. Research reveals that when people think they've uncovered a hidden pattern, like connecting current events to an ancient prediction, their brains release a pleasure surge similar to solving a puzzle. Kings and emperors essentially turned governance into a cosmic treasure hunt, scattering enough vague prophecies to guarantee regular dopamine hits of discovery. The Roman Senate's use of the Sibylline books worked like a slot machine. Pull the lever often enough, and eventually, a winning prophecy would align with current events, reinforcing the addiction to divine reassurance. The comfort of control plays an equally sinister role. Clinical psychology shows that people exposed to unpredictable stress like famines or invasions cling tighter to beliefs that offer structure, even false ones. Ancient rulers leveraged this like emotional blackmail. After a plague, Pharaoh could claim the gods demanded more temples, after a drought, Chinese emperors found prophecies blaming corrupt officials. By framing crises as tests of faith rather than failures of leadership, they turned desperation into devotion. Modern experiments reveal how easily this translates today. In one study, participants shown fake, ancient prophecies that seemed to predict contemporary events overwhelmingly rated them as credible, even when the wording was blatantly vague. This Barnum effect, named after the huckster P.T. Barnum, explains why prophecies thrive in every era, their linguistic Rorschach tests reflecting back whatever we fear or desire. Yet the darkest insight comes from cognitive dissonance. Once someone invests in a prophetic narrative, whether about an emperor's divine right or a modern conspiracy, they'll twist contradictory evidence to preserve the belief. Assyrian tablets show scribes frantically revising old omens when predictions failed, just as today's doomsday cults reinterpret dates rather than abandon faith. The brain would rather rewrite reality than admit it was fooled. Understanding this science doesn't just explain ancient manipulation, it warns us about its modern disguises. From algorithmic predictions of our preferences to politicians framing policies as historically inevitable, the same neural levers are still being pulled. The temples may be digital now, but the priesthoods remain. The most haunting prophecies in literature often echo the very real political machinations of ancient courts. Take Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, where a king's desperate attempt to outrun a prophecy that he'd kill his father and marry his mother only ensures its fulfillment. This wasn't just dramatic irony, it mirrored how rulers like Alexander the Great spun self-fulfilling prophecies to cement their legacies. The play's chilling twist. Oedipus's downfall comes not from the prophecy itself, but from his frantic efforts to control it, a lesson ancient kings learned the hard way when their fabricated destinies unraveled. Shakespeare's Macbeth digs even deeper into this psychological warfare. The witch's ambiguous prediction that Macbeth would become king didn't just plant ambition. It exposed how easily vague prophecies could be weaponized. Their phrasing, "none of woman born shall harm Macbeth," mirrored real historical tricks like the Delphic oracle's riddles. When Macbeth clings to these words as invincibility, he misses the loophole. Macduff, born by cesarean, wasn't of woman born in the strictest sense. This wasn't just poetic license. It reflected how rulers from Rome to Babylon twisted literal interpretations to suit their needs, only to be undone by their own literal-mindedness. But perhaps the most revealing link between myth and reality lies in Virgil's Aeneid. Written to glorify Augustus, the epic claims Aeneas's wanderings were foretold to lead to Rome's founding, a blatant parallel to how Augustus's propagandists tied his reign to ancient Sibylline prophecies. The poem even features a scene where Aeneas's destiny is literally etched on a prophetic shield, mirroring how emperors stamped their divine futures onto coins and monuments. The Aeneid wasn't just literature, it was soft power, blurring the line between myth and state propaganda so thoroughly that Romans began treating the story as historical fact. Norse sagas took a darker turn with the concept of weird, an inescapable fate even gods couldn't alter. The Völuspá, a poem detailing the gods' doom at Ragnarok, reads like a celestial coup. Odin's attempts to avert disaster only hasten it, much like real-world kings who staged omens to avoid rebellion only to provoke it. The saga's fixation on cyclical destruction resonated in cultures like Mesopotamia, where kings used prophecies of renewal to justify purging rivals. Even the Etic Cirrus Volva, who delivers the prophecy, mirrors real-life oracle figures like the Pythia outsiders whose divine words conveniently served those in power. The Arthurian legends offer a subtler case study. Merlin's prophecies often read like political advisories disguised as mysticism. When he predicts Arthur's rise, it echoes how medieval rulers like Henry II used astrologers to legitimize their dubious claims to the throne. Later versions of the myth even have Merlin orchestrating Arthur's birth through magical deception, a fantastical parallel to how historical kings arranged prophecies about their divine origins. The Round Table's eventual collapse, foretold but unheeded, mirrors real dynasties that ignored manufactured omens until it was too late. What makes these stories endure isn't their supernatural elements, but their uncomfortable truths about power. The Trojan Cassandra, cursed to prophesy truths no one believed, embodies how dissenting voices in ancient courts were silenced, her warnings dismissed, just like Babylonian priests who opposed Nabonidus's reforms. Meanwhile, the Epic of Gilgamesh subverts the trope. When the hero seeks immortality, the gods remind him that only they decree fates. It's a stark metaphor for how rulers monopolized prophecy to deny mortals, meaning their subjects, any say in their destinies. These tales endure because they peel back the curtain on history's greatest magic trick, convincing people that power isn't taken, but given by gods, by stars, by prophecies older than memory. And the darkest irony, the most fictional prophecies often hewed closest to reality. When Oedipus stumbles blindly into exile or Macbeth clutches at straws of certainty, we're not just watching tragedy, we're seeing the raw mechanics of how fate was manufactured, one whispered prediction at a time. History remembers kings and conquerors, but the hands that shaped fate often belonged to women, voices dismissed as vessels of the gods, yet sharper than any sword. The Pythia of Delphi wasn't just a priestess in a trance, she was the most powerful political advisor in Greece, her cryptic words swaying wars and toppling dynasties. When Athenian leaders consulted her before the Persian Wars, her ambiguous prophecies became the backbone of their strategy, interpretations that could mean salvation or doom, depending on who whispered in her ear beforehand. The brilliance of her role, she never issued orders, only riddles. Men in power fought to claim her words as their own, never realizing how much control she wielded by remaining just obscure enough to be indispensable. Across the Mediterranean, the Sibyls operated as a shadow network of influence. These prophetesses, scattered from Cumae to Erythrae, didn't wait for rulers to seek them out, they sent their visions into the world like political time bombs. The Cumaean Sibyl's prophecies were so valued that Rome's kings bought her books at legendary cost, only to lock them away where no one could read them without priestly approval. But here's the twist, the Sibyls' real power lay in their ambiguity. When the Roman Republic crumbled, competing factions mined those same texts for opposing interpretations, each claiming the Sibyl backed their cause. The women who'd penned those words centuries earlier had crafted a language so fluid it outlived empires. In Egypt, the god's wife of Ammon held a title that sounds ceremonial until you realize she was the human embodiment of divine will. These high priestesses, often Pharaoh's daughters or sisters, didn't just perform rituals, they issued oracles that could make or break military campaigns. When Hatshepsut needed to legitimize her unprecedented rule as female pharaoh, she didn't rely solely on her own propaganda. She had the god's wife, her daughter Nephera, proclaim that Ammon himself had ordained her reign. The statues and inscriptions show a carefully staged symbiosis. The king's power flowed through the priestess's lips, and the priestess's authority came from the king's patronage. It was a divine feedback loop, and women controlled the volume. Yet some prophetesses turned their gifts into weapons of resistance. In Babylon, the Nadatu priestesses, women who lived in cloistered temple communities, were trusted with interpreting celestial omens. When King Nabonidus alienated the priesthood by elevating the moon god Sin over Marduk, these women began circulating alternative readings of the stars, subtly undermining his legitimacy. Their predictions carried weight precisely because they were believed to be apolitical, their celibacy and seclusion seen as guarantees of purity. By the time Cyrus the Great invaded, many Babylonians were primed to see him as a liberator, thanks to years of quiet prophetic subversion. The darker side of this influence emerged in times of crisis. During Rome's civil wars, a prophetess named Martha gained terrifying sway over the general Marius, her doomsday predictions fueling his paranoia and bloodshed. Ancient historians paint her as a fanatic, but modern eyes might recognize something else: a woman exploiting the chaos of male ambition to carve her own niche of power. Similarly, the Germanic seeress Velida became a rallying point for rebels against Rome, her prophecies uniting tribes across the Rhine. The Romans couldn't defeat her on the battlefield because her real weapon was the intangible, the belief that she channeled destiny itself. What made these women so effective was the very thing that made them non-threatening to patriarchal systems. Their power was framed as passive, mere conduits for divine voices, not thinkers shaping events. But the historical record betrays glimpses of cunning agency. The Pythia's chamber at Delphi was designed so that priests could whisper to her unseen, but who's to say she didn't filter those whispers through her own agenda? The Sibylline books were guarded by men, but written by women whose original intent may have been far subversive than later edits revealed. Even the trope of the mad prophetess, Cassandra wailing unheard warnings, speaks to a deeper truth. When women's foresight clashed with male ambitions, it was often easier to dismiss them as hysterics than heed them. The ultimate irony: many of these women's names are lost, their individual identities swallowed by their titles. We remember the Pythia, not the dozens of women who held that role across centuries. The Sibyls blur together in legend, their distinct voices flattened into a single mystical archetype. Yet their legacy lingers in the quiet ways prophecy still operates, through pundits, algorithms, and influencers who package uncertainty as inevitability. The game hasn't changed, we've just stopped acknowledging the players. The tension between fate and free will wasn't just a philosophical puzzle, it was a battlefield where entire worldviews clashed. In ancient Greece, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides turned this debate into gripping drama. Take Oedipus, doomed by a prophecy he tries desperately to avoid, only to fulfill it through his very attempts to escape. The chilling message: resistance might be part of the prophecy itself. Yet in the same era, Athenian philosophers like Protagoras argued that man is the measure of all things, insisting humans carve their own path. This wasn't abstract theorizing, it shaped real-world decisions. When the Spartan general Lysander consulted the oracle of Delphi before a critical battle, he didn't just accept the priestess's words, he reinterpreted them on the spot, twisting a vague warning into a tactical advantage. The gods might set the stage, but mortals could still rewrite the script. Confucian scholars took a radically different approach to them. Destiny wasn't a fixed path, but a dynamic interplay between heavenly mandate and human virtue. The Analects record Confucius dismissing obsessive divination, declaring that cultivating moral character mattered more than reading omens. Yet even he acknowledged the mandate of heaven as a guiding force, not as blind fate, but as a cosmic reward for righteous conduct. This subtle balance allowed Chinese rulers to claim divine favor while holding themselves accountable. If disasters struck, it wasn't fate's cruelty but proof the ruler had strayed from virtue, inviting heaven's correction. The lesson: prophecies didn't dictate outcomes, they set the terms for a negotiation between mortal actions and cosmic will. Nowhere was this debate more visceral than in Rome's Stoic circles. Seneca famously wrote that fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling, suggesting prophecies were less about controlling the future than preparing the mind. When Emperor Marcus Aurelius faced plague and war, his meditations reveal a man grappling with this duality, accepting events as fated while insisting on his duty to act justly. Practical consequences followed. Roman generals often ignored unfavorable omens if their strategic judgment demanded it, proving that even in a culture steeped in divination, free will could trump celestial signs. The Hebrew tradition introduced yet another perspective: prophecy as moral warning, not inevitable decree. The Book of Jonah shows a Nineveh doomed by prophecy until its people's repentance literally rewrites their fate. This idea that divine words set conditions rather than destinations echoed through Jewish scholars like Maimonides, who argued that true prophecies were less predictions than divine advice to be heeded or ignored. The power lay not in the prophecy's fulfillment, but in the choices it inspired. Even polytheistic cultures had their rebels against rigid fate. Norse sagas brim with heroes like Ragnar Lothbrok, who laughs at prophecies of his death, choosing to face the serpents anyway. His defiance isn't portrayed as folly, but as existential courage, the assertion that how one meets destiny matters more than whether one escapes it. Similarly, Aztec warriors embraced the prophecy of cyclical apocalypse, not with resignation, but with a resolve to fight gloriously, ensuring their place in the next cosmic cycle. The through line in all these traditions, a recognition that prophecies gained power through belief, not magic. Whether seen as warnings, challenges, or illusions, their true force came from how societies chose to engage them. The Athenian who altered his plans after a bad omen, the Chinese minister who cited ancient texts to curb his emperor's excesses, the Viking who charged into battle despite knowing his fate, all were wrestling with the same question: is destiny a prison or a mirror reflecting our own choices back at us? What makes this ancient debate so urgent today is its uncanny resonance with modern determinism. Just as ancients wondered if the stars dictated their lives, we grapple with whether genes, algorithms, or economic forces leave any room for genuine agency. The past offers no easy answers, but it does provide a compass reminding us that the most enduring prophecies aren't those that predict the future, but those that provoke us to shape it. The line between divine revelation and political strategy was often invisible because ancient rulers worked tirelessly to keep it that way. Consider the biblical King David, whose rise to power was framed as a sacred destiny. When the prophet Samuel anointed him while Saul still sat on the throne, it wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a calculated transfer of legitimacy. The Hebrew scriptures meticulously document these divine endorsements, portraying David's victories as fulfillments of prophecy. Yet scrolls found at Qumran reveal a fascinating counter-narrative: rival factions circulating alternative prophecies that painted Saul as the true chosen one. This wasn't just theological debate, it was ancient spin doctoring, where holy texts doubled as press releases in a battle for hearts and minds. Compare this to Rome's emperor cult, where politics wore the mask of religion without apology. Augustus didn't just build temples, he engineered his own divinity, commissioning prophecies that tied his reign to Virgil's fourth eclogue, a poem mysteriously predicting a golden child who would bring peace. The genius lay in ambiguity. Was this a spiritual vision or political allegory? The answer depended on whether you were a senator needing justification or a peasant seeking comfort. Meanwhile, in Egypt, pharaohs like Ramses the Great went further, carving battle scenes where gods literally handed them swords, blurring the lines between military reportage and divine mandate. The tension between sacred and political prophecy exploded during the Maccabean revolt, when the Seleucid king Antiochus Roman IV desecrated the Jewish temple, rebels circulated long-forgotten passages from Daniel predicting a horned tyrant who would profane the sanctuary. These weren't just rallying cries, they were time-released weapons, written centuries earlier with language vague enough to fit new oppressors. The same scrolls that comforted the faithful during Babylonian exile now fueled revolution against Greek rule, proving that religious texts could be the ultimate sleeper cells of political resistance. Yet some of history's most striking examples come from the pagan world. The Pythia at Delphi famously straddled this divide. When city-states consulted her before wars, her responses often reflected Apollo's will, but also Delphi's financial ties to certain patrons. A classic case is the Persian Wars, where the oracle initially advised Athens to flee before Xerxes' invasion. Only after an Athenian bribe, donation, did she offer the famous wooden walls prophecy that led to naval victory at Salamis. The gods' voices, it seemed, carried distinct monetary echoes. This duality reached its peak in the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Constantine's vision of the Cairo symbol before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge could be read as genuine religious experience or brilliant morale-boosting theater. His subsequent enforcement of Christian orthodoxy through councils like Nicaea didn't just standardize belief, it centralized interpretive power. Now, only approved priests could declare what prophecies meant, turning theology into an extension of imperial policy. The same pattern emerged in Islamic caliphates, where hadiths sayings of Muhammad were meticulously curated to support competing dynasties. A single prophetic tradition might validate both Sunni and Shia claims, depending on which scholar you ask. The Aztecs took this fusion to visceral extremes. Their state religion taught that Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, required human hearts to keep the cosmos running, a prophecy that conveniently justified endless wars for sacrificial captives. But when drought struck, priests suddenly remembered additional prophecies demanding tribute from subject cities. Natural disasters became spiritual shakedowns, with celestial threats enforcing earthly taxation. What unified these disparate cultures was the realization that the most potent prophecies lived in the liminal space between fear and hope. A purely political prediction risked being exposed as manipulation. A wholly spiritual one might lack immediate urgency. But combine the two, you got the Maya's long count calendar, which wove astronomical precision with apocalyptic warnings, keeping peasants obedient and astronomers employed. Or Tudor England's exploitation of Merlin's prophecies, where Henry VII claimed Welsh legends about a red dragon foretold his rise from obscurity to throne. The irony is that this very ambiguity eventually undermined prophecy's power. As Enlightenment thinkers like Spinoza dissected biblical texts, exposing human fingerprints on divine words, rulers lost their monopoly on celestial messaging. Yet the instinct remains. Modern politicians still invoke city upon a hill visions or arc of history rhetoric, dressing policy in prophetic robes. The mediums have changed from stone tablets to teleprompters, but the alchemy endures. Take earthly ambition, gild it with higher purpose, and watch as mortal schemes take on the sheen of destiny. Ambiguity wasn't just a feature of ancient prophecies, it was their lifeblood. The most enduring predictions thrived on what they didn't say, leaving just enough room for reinterpretation to fit any twist of fate. Consider the legendary oracle of Delphi's reply to King Croesus. If you wage war, a great empire will fall. On its face, it sounded like a green light for victory. Only after his defeat did the chilling truth emerge. The empire destined to fall was his own. This wasn't a failed prophecy. It was a masterclass in linguistic trap setting, designed to make the oracle infallible no matter the outcome. The mechanics of these verbal mazes reveal a deliberate craft. Babylonian astrologers perfected the art of the disjunctive prophecy, phrasing that offered multiple outs. A tablet might warn, either the king will face rebellion, or a great flood will come, or the gods will show mercy. Covered for every scenario, the diviner could later emphasize whichever half came true while quietly ignoring the rest. The Assyrians took it further, issuing prophecies with built-in expiration dates. Phrases like, "in the days to come," or "before the moon wanes twice," created just enough temporal wiggle room to stretch meanings as needed. Political operators quickly realized the power of this strategic vagueness. When Rome's Senate needed public backing for a controversial war, they'd consult the Sibylline books, inevitably finding verses like, "Beware the red tide beyond the sea." Was it a warning against Carthage, a metaphor for bloodshed? The ambiguity allowed leaders to steer interpretation like a ship through fog, adjusting course as circumstances demanded. Even natural disasters could be retrofitted into prophecy. After the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Nero's critics dusted off old verses about the mountain that breathes fire upon the unjust, suddenly applying them to his decadent reign. The real genius lay in layered meanings. Take the Chinese Tui Bei Tu, a collection of cryptic poems and illustrations supposedly predicting events centuries ahead. One passage describes a woman wearing armor riding a dragon, which Ming Dynasty scholars claimed foretold Empress Wu Zetian's rise, even though the text was likely altered after her reign to fit the narrative. Similarly, Norse rune castings often spoke of the serpent's return or the ash tree's fall, phrases flexible enough to signify anything from a bad harvest to an invading army. Religious texts were particularly ripe for this kind of elastic interpretation. The Book of Revelation's apocalyptic imagery, seven-headed beasts, numbers like 666, was deliberately opaque, allowing every generation to map its fears onto the symbolism. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's followers declared the Pope was the Antichrist foretold in those verses, while Catholics flipped the script, applying the same passages to Luther himself. The prophecy didn't change, only the interpreters did. Modern audiences might dismiss this as charlatanism, but the psychological brilliance is undeniable. A study at the University of Pennsylvania found that people rate vague statements as profoundly accurate if they're told they're personalized prophecies. This Barnum effect explains why rulers clung to ambiguity. It tapped into the human brain's pattern-seeking desperation. When the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma heard Spanish ships matched an old prophecy about floating towers, his paralysis wasn't just superstition. It was the cognitive dissonance of a mind trained to see meaning in the inexplicable. The legacy of these slippery prophecies lingers wherever power seeks unquestioned authority. From modern political slogans like "change is coming" to corporate missions promising "innovation for tomorrow," the same principles apply. Make the statement broad enough to fit any outcome, and let the audience's hope or fear do the rest. The greatest trick the ancients taught us wasn't predicting the future. It was making sure no one could prove you wrong about it. Ancient rulers didn't just demand gold and grain, they packaged their greed in divine wrappings. When the Egyptian pharaohs needed funds for their colossal temples, they didn't send tax collectors, they sent priests bearing oracles, warning that the Nile would flood catastrophically unless the people funded new shrines to appease the gods. The logic was mercilessly effective: pay up or starve when the crops failed. This wasn't charity, it was celestial extortion, with prophecies as the ransom note. The Mesopotamians turned this into a science. Kings like Hammurabi issued divine decrees etched on stone steels, listing tax rates alongside blessings from Shamash, the sun god. Miss a payment, the tablets warned of droughts and plagues, divine penalties that conveniently justified royal bailiffs seizing land. Even trade routes fell under prophetic control. Merchants traveling through Babylon had to pay tolls at temples where priests read omens ensuring safe passage for a fee. The message was clear: commerce flowed where the gods willed it, and the gods' intermediaries just happened to prefer full coffers. Rome refined the art of sacred economics with the Sibylline books. When the treasury ran low, senators would discover verses demanding new public games or temples projects that conveniently funneled taxes into politically connected builders. Emperor Vespasian took it further after the Great Fire, imposing a urine tax, yes, on public toilets, while his poets circulated prophecies about golden streams revitalizing Rome. The citizens grumbled but paid, after all, who argued with a god's plumbing advice. China's mandate of heaven had an economic clause. Natural disasters signaled divine displeasure at hoarded wealth. Emperors used this to break up powerful landowning clans, redistributing acres to peasants while skimming a hefty cut for the throne. The Tang dynasty even issued disaster prophecies, targeting regions with untapped silver mines, then generously offered tax relief in exchange for mining rights. The heavens, it seemed, were excellent geologists. The darkest alchemy occurred in Mesoamerica. Aztec priests declared that the sun god Huitzilopochtli demanded tribute not just in hearts, but in cocoa beans, jade, and textiles, all currencies of the empire. Their prophetic calendar tied payment deadlines to celestial events, turning astronomy into an accounting ledger. Miss a quota, the priests helpfully noted the stars predicted famine until balance was restored. THROUGH Chinese letter contributions. Even medieval Europe played the game. Popes funded crusades by selling indulgences, promises of divine forgiveness backed by Old Testament prophecies about reclaiming Holy Land. Kings imposed Saladin tithes, named after a Muslim foe, while troubadours sang of ancient seers foreseeing Christian wealth flowing east. The war chests filled, and the prophecies grew more urgent coincidentally, just as royal debts came due. The genius of this system was its circular logic. Taxes weren't theft, they were tributes to avert prophesied doom. Price hikes weren't greed, they were adjustments to align with celestial harmony. And when rulers bankrupted their realms, why, that too was foretold, proof the gods were purging corruption, not that leaders had mismanaged the books. The receipts weren't kept in ledgers but in the stars. Modern echoes reverberate in every too big to fail bailout or austerity prophecy, warning of economic collapse without painful reforms. The oracles now wear suits and quote spreadsheets, but the playbook remains unchanged. Wrap necessity in inevitability, and even the bitterest pill goes down smoother when swallowed as destiny. War drums and battle cries weren't the only weapons ancient generals wielded. They fought with stories, weaving prophecies into the very fabric of warfare to turn soldiers into believers and enemies into heretics. When Alexander the Great faced the seemingly unconquerable walls of Tyre in 332 BCE, he didn't just rely on siege engines. He resurrected an old prophecy claiming the city would fall when the sea retreated. Then, in a stroke of theatrical brilliance, he ordered his engineers to build a massive causeway, turning the island fortress into a peninsula. As the Macedonian army stormed across the land bridge, the message was clear. Alexander wasn't just defying geography, he was fulfilling destiny. The psychological impact was devastating. Tyrian defenders who'd laughed at his initial assaults now fought with desperation, convinced the gods themselves had abandoned them. This fusion of prophecy and warfare reached its zenith during the Crusades. Before the Battle of Antioch in 1098, starving Christian knights unearthed a relic, the holy lance supposedly revealed through divine visions. Whether planted or genuinely discovered, the effect was electric. Demoralized troops transformed into fanatics, charging into battle, convinced celestial forces guided their swords. Chroniclers later claimed angels fought beside them, but the real miracle was how a single artifact, wrapped in prophecy, turned near certain defeat into a rallying cry that echoed across centuries. The Mongols, often seen as pragmatic conquerors, mastered a darker variation of this art. Before attacking a city, Genghis Khan's scouts would spread rumors that local priests had foreseen their victory in cryptic omens, a raven flying west, a blood-red moon. By the time Mongol horsemen appeared on the horizon, many defenders were already half defeated, their will eroded by the creeping suspicion that resistance was futile. When Kiev fell in 1240, survivors swore they'd heard prophecies days earlier about iron men riding beasts of thunder, a narrative the Mongols encouraged to justify their inevitability. Yet the most chilling examples came from psychological operations designed not to inspire but to paralyze. When Rome besieged Carthage, they didn't just encircle the city, they staged nightly rituals where priests hurled curses across the walls, chanting prophecies of famine and childless futures. Archaeological evidence suggests Carthaginians responded with their own counter-propaganda, scattering lead tablets inscribed with hexes against Roman generals. This wasn't just superstition, it was early information warfare where the battlefield extended into dreams and prayers. Naval conflicts also swam in prophetic currents. Before the Battle of Salamis, Athenian commanders circulated a Delphic oracle's ambiguous verse about wooden walls saving Greece. Some argued it meant fortifying the Acropolis, but Themistocles insisted it prophesied their fleet. His interpretation won out, and when their triremes crushed the Persian navy, the victory was framed not as tactical brilliance but as divine will manifest through ships. The lesson: control the narrative, and you control how history remembers the fight. Even failures were spun into prophetic victories. After the disastrous Roman defeat at Cannae, surviving senators pored over the Sibylline books until they found a passage predicting Rome would endure only after enduring unimaginable loss. The catastrophe was rebranded as a necessary trial, a cosmic test passed by those who kept faith. Centuries later, Confederate generals during the American Civil War employed similar tactics, quoting biblical prophecies about the righteous remnant to explain away battlefield losses. Defeat wasn't failure, it was purification. The inverse was equally potent. Prophecies could be weapons of terror against foes. Aztec armies sent ahead omens, staged eclipses, arranged animal sacrifices to convince enemy cities their gods had turned against them. During Japan's Genpei War, the Minamoto clan spread rumors that their rival Terra had angered the dragon kami, citing miraculous tidal patterns as proof. When the tides actually shifted during a critical naval battle, it cemented a legend that outlasted the war itself. What made these tactics endure was their adaptability. A prophecy could be as simple as a commander pointing to a flock of birds at dawn and declaring their flight path signaled divine favor, or as elaborate as the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius commissioning an entire epic poem tracing his war against Persia to Adam and Eve's fall. The common thread: warfare wasn't just fought with steel and fire, but with the stories soldiers told themselves about why they fought and why they might win. Modern militaries still harness echoes of this power, from the manifest destiny rhetoric of 19th century expansions to the mission accomplished banners of modern conflicts. The uniforms and weapons change, but the playbook remains. Convince people they're not just fighting for land or leaders, but for something written in the stars. And perhaps that's the most enduring prophecy of all: the certainty that as long as wars are waged, someone will claim the heavens chose their side. The whispers of ancient oracles didn't vanish when the temples crumbled. They simply found new megaphones. Today's politicians might not consult sheep livers before passing laws, but the playbook remains eerily familiar. Take the concept of manifest destiny that fueled American expansion in the 19th century. It wasn't just a policy, it was a prophecy framed as geographical inevitability, painting westward movement as divine will rather than conquest. The same rhetorical sleight of hand used by Babylonian kings to justify territorial grabs now played out with covered wagons and railroad spikes. Media empires have become the new Delphi, shaping public perception through carefully curated narratives. A modern news cycle operates like the Sibylline books, where selective, expert predictions or historical trends are trotted out to frame events as unavoidable. During economic crises, pundits declare recessions, long foretold, echoing how Roman senators blamed financial collapses on ignored omens. The language of inevitability, the market will correct, change is coming, serves the same psychological purpose as ancient prophecies, to make chaotic realities feel ordered and to position those in power as interpreters of fate rather than its architects. Hollywood, too, has mastered the art of manufactured destiny. Blockbuster franchises like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings hinge on prophecies that mirror royal propaganda from antiquity. When a character learns they're the chosen one, it's no accident the plot mirrors how pharaohs or medieval kings cemented legitimacy. Even dystopian tales follow the script. The Hunger Games Mockingjay prophecy isn't just a rebel symbol. It's a narrative tool to turn a frightened girl into a revolutionary icon, much like Joan of Arc's visions were weaponized to rally armies. Social media algorithms function like digital haruspices, scouring behavior patterns to predict our desires and then shaping them. When a platform tells you, "You might like this," or "People like you bought that," it's not just suggestion. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy designed to narrow your choices into profitable channels. The ancient priests who read star patterns to guide kings would recognize the tactic instantly, present a curated version of reality as destiny, and watch people march toward it. Yet the most potent legacy lies in authoritarian playbooks. Modern dictators don't need stone tablets. They have state media declaring their rise, historically inevitable, or opponents, doomed by the arc of justice. North Korea's Juche ideology frames its rulers as cosmically ordained, while Putin's speeches invoke thousand-year destinies to justify invasions. The packaging is sleek, but the machinery is as old as the pyramids. Control the story, and you control the fear. Even protest movements harness these ancient tools. Climate activists don't just cite data, they frame action as the only way to avert prophesied disaster, using language closer to the Aztec priests' warning of solar collapse than dry policy debates. The brilliance and danger of this approach is its flexibility. Just as Delphi's oracle could flip a prophecy's meaning post-defeat, modern movements recalibrate urgency when timelines shift. The apocalypse is always near enough to compel action, but never so near that failure discredits the prophets. What connects these threads is the human longing for narrative order. Ancient rulers didn't invent the desire to believe life follows a script, they exploited it. Now, as then, the real power belongs to those who understand that destiny isn't written in stars or algorithms, but in the collective decision to treat certain stories as sacred. The great irony, the most accurate prophecy of all might be that as long as humans crave meaning, others will keep selling it to them for a price. The threads of ancient prophecy manipulation weave through time, stitching together empires and ideologies with the same invisible needle. What began as kings etching divine endorsements onto temple walls now lives on in subtler forms: algorithms predicting our desires, headlines declaring historical inevitability, and leaders framing their agendas as the unstoppable tide of progress. The tools have evolved, but the game remains unchanged. Dress ambition in the robes of destiny, and people will follow without question. Consider how modern movements borrow from this ancient playbook. When politicians invoke the arc of history, bending toward justice, they're channeling the same rhetorical alchemy as Roman emperors citing Sibylline prophecies. The phrase isn't just poetry, it's psychological judo transforming debate into surrender. Why argue with a future already written? Similarly, Silicon Valley's cult of disruption mirrors Babylonian priests interpreting market trends like celestial omens, declaring certain technologies inevitable while obscuring the human hands guiding their adoption. Yet the most potent legacy lies in our own complicity. Every time we share a post declaring everything happens for a reason or nod along to pundits forecasting doom, we become the priests of Delphi, interpreting vague signs to fit our biases. Social media's echo chambers function like ancient oracle pits, where ambiguous events are molded into confirmations of whatever narrative we crave. The Assyrians would envy the efficiency. This isn't a call for cynicism, but clarity. Recognizing prophecies' enduring disguise, whether in sacred scrolls or viral tweets, arms us against its most dangerous illusion. That power belongs only to those who claim to speak for forces beyond our control. History's greatest lesson isn't that fate is fake, but that it's collaborative. The future has always been a story, and stories change when new voices grab the pen. So the next time someone tells you something is meant to be, ask who benefits from that belief. When algorithms whisper you'll love a product, question who programmed the desire. And when leaders invoke destiny to justify their rule, remember the oldest trick in the book. The gods never spoke, only the people who claimed to hear them did. The real prophecy worth believing, that the power to shape tomorrow was never in the stars, but in the choices we make and the stories we refuse to accept at face value. If this journey through the shadows of history resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below with your take. Have you spotted modern-day prophecy manipulation in action? And as always, if you enjoyed unraveling these secrets of the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world. Until next time, stay curious and maybe question that next prediction just a little